Last thing we're going to do before we annotate, just make sure that we're in fairly good shape with our numbers. So that's checking our residual pressure. Now, when I turn this on, there's not much friction loss because the water doesn't have to go very far. It doesn't have to go very far. Even if it's a fair amount of water, friction loss is how fast it's going and how far it has to go. And so these aren't too critical. They have something to do with it. These ones, if they're not all turned on at once, the water will come here and then it'll flow down this way. And that could be by the time all of these are turned on and this one goes, it's going a fairly long way. And that could be of interest to us. And we'd have to calculate the friction all that way with everything being on and see what happens. But the one that's probably the most concerning, these flushometers and valves on the lavatories really make for a heavy duty friction loss, and it's a long way to go. So I'd have to calculate these, and I'd have to go, okay, how big is the pipe? How fast is it moving? It's going through some fittings. How big is it, and how fast is it moving? And how far does it have to go, and what happens? And that's all very time consuming and difficult. But fortunately, Revit does it for us. And that's what I was looking at here. Our critical path, he says, okay, the worst one that you have to deal with is through these pipe segments and fittings. And when everything is being used at once, I'm going to have 35.48. I'm going to call it 35.5 psi loss. Now, residual pressure means that I've got some pressure coming into my building. And when everything is going on, I have a pressure at each fixture. And remember, fixtures are set to work at 22.5 psi. So I have to have at least 22.5 psi. So if my water is flowing and it's losing pressure due to friction by the time it gets all the way over to here, and I have less than 22.5 psi in the pipes, I've got a problem. My fixture won't work. Won't work as intended, at least. So I want to make sure that I've got that. So I have to know how much pressure is coming into my building. In this building, we're going to pretend that we have 60 psi. That's very, very common in the Sacramento area, 60 psi. So we have 60 psi coming in. And then because of all this friction loss, as the water just travels through this pipe, it gets 55, 50, 45, 40, 35. And by the time it gets to here, it's going to be 60 minus 35.5, 24.5 psi. Well, that works. It's okay. It's above 22.5. Now, some companies will make you have a little bit more margin of error than that, and some companies won't as you do your design. That's up to your engineer to tell you what to do. But these Revit calculations are pretty good. They have some standards in them. For instance, this toilet doesn't really use that much water, but because it's got a flushometer, whoosh, it really draws down the pressure when you flush it. And if you flush this one and this one and this one and this one at the same time, it really does have an effect. I can tell you by personal experience at a prison in Tennessee that can happen. So I was sent there, and that's what we found out was happening. They all figured out to flush the toilets at the same time and break the system. So this one's strong enough. It can do it. All right. So we start at 60 and we slowly lose pressure when everything is turned on. The friction of all that water running down these pipes draws down the pressure. And by the time it gets to the end, I've got 60 minus whatever I end up here, 35.5 equals 24.5. And I compare that. It is bigger than 22.5, so I'm okay.